Missiles hit oil tankers in the Strait of Hormuz this week. Brent crude jumped nearly 5% in a single trading session, then slid back down within 48 hours. If that whiplash sounds familiar, it should. On July 6th and 7th, Iran struck 3 vessels near the strait, including a Qatari-flagged LNG carrier, a liquefied natural gas vessel, and a Saudi-flagged crude tanker, both damaged in missile strikes attributed to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The United States responded within a day, hitting more than 80 Iranian targets, air defense sites, radar installations, small boats, anti-ship missile positions, in a campaign U.S. Central Command described as restoring deterrence. In practice, the U.S. government no longer trusts the ceasefire enough to let Iranian barrels flow freely, even temporarily. At a summit of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, held in Turkey, President Trump told reporters he considered the ceasefire over. 2 days later, he walked that back, saying he didn't expect a full return to war. That kind of contradiction, stated 2 days apart by the same man holding the same office, is not a communication slip. It's a sign that nobody currently running Western energy policy actually knows which way this goes. The Treasury Department, for its part, quietly canceled its earlier authorization, letting Iran sell oil on the open market. Ship tracking data showed transits through the strait continuing, but reduced, and mostly confined to routes Iran had explicitly cleared. By July 9th, Brent had eased back to somewhere between $73 and $77 a barrel, still measurably higher than where it sat 2 weeks earlier, when a ceasefire deal signed at the Palace of Versailles had briefly convinced traders the crisis was ending. It hasn't ended. And the reason it hasn't ended traces back more than 50 years to a choke point crisis that also started with a war nobody planned for and ended with a price level the world never fully walked back. This isn't the first time a choke point crisis has scrambled the global oil market and dragged energy policy into a shooting war. In October of 1973, Egypt and Syria attacked Israel on Yom Kippur, and within 2 weeks, Arab oil-producing states had turned crude oil into a weapon aimed squarely at the United States and its allies. That crisis is known simply as the 1973 oil embargo, and it remains the reference point every energy analyst reaches for when prices spike on geopolitical news rather than physical scarcity. A lot of the modern machinery of energy security was actually built out of that episode. The parallel isn't a stretch. Both crises begin with a regional war few in the West saw coming. Both saw oil markets move on fear before a single barrel actually stopped flowing. And both forced governments to reach for tools, strategic reserves, and emergency diplomacy that either didn't exist yet or had never been tested at this scale. To understand why 1973 still matters, you have to start with the war, not the oil. On October 6th of that year, Egyptian and Syrian forces launched a coordinated surprise attack on Israeli positions in the Sinai and the Golan Heights, catching Israel on its holiest day, Yom Kippur. The United States moved fast to resupply its ally. On October 12th, President Nixon ordered Operation Nickel Grass, a massive military airlift that flew tanks, artillery, and aircraft parts directly into Israeli hands while the fighting was still underway. The Soviet Union was doing the same for Egypt and Syria. Within days, a regional war had become a proxy contest between two nuclear superpowers, and the oil-producing states of the Arab world were watching closely. They already had a grievance separate from the war itself. Since the 1959 Tehran pricing agreement, Western oil companies, the group historians call the Seven Sisters, had controlled how much producing nations were paid for their own crude. That arrangement was cracking under its own weight by the early 70s, as a weakening U.S. dollar, following the collapse of the Bretton Woods monetary system, made the fixed dollar-denominated price of oil worth less every year to the countries pumping it. On October 8th through 10th, talks between OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, and the major oil companies. To revise that pricing agreement collapsed entirely. 6 days later, at a summit in Kuwait City, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Abu Dhabi, Kuwait, and Qatar raised posted oil prices by roughly 17% to $3.65 a barrel and announced production cuts on top of it. The next day, October 17th, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, known as OPEC, a narrower Arab-only bloc distinct from OPEC as a whole, went further. Its oil ministers agreed to use crude oil as direct leverage against Israel's Western backers, recommending a formal embargo against any country that didn't fall in line. Libya moved first, declaring an immediate embargo against the United States on October 19th. The same day, President Nixon asked Congress for $2.2 billion in emergency military aid for Israel. Saudi Arabia and the other Arab producers followed on October 20th, cutting off the United States, along with the Netherlands, Portugal, and South Africa. Saudi Arabia's oil minister at the time, Ahmed Zaki Yamani, later described King Faisal's actual preference as more cautious than the embargo that resulted. Yamani recalled the king wanting a gradual production cut, in his words, to give the United States. The shooting war ended fast. Egypt, Syria, and Israel agreed to a ceasefire on October 25th. The oil embargo did not end with it. Through November, U.S. retail gasoline prices jumped by roughly 40% in a single month. Americans who had never waited in line for gasoline in their lives were suddenly doing it for hours, some states resorting to odd-even rationing based on license plate numbers. By January of 1974, the posted price of oil had climbed to $11.65 a barrel. According to Federal Reserve historical records, roughly 4 times what it had been before the crisis began. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger spent that winter in what became known as shuttle diplomacy, flying repeatedly between Washington, Jerusalem, and Riyadh to negotiate an actual Israeli military disengagement from Egyptian territory. That agreement, signed January 18, 1974, gave Arab states a genuine political outcome to point to, something the embargo alone had not produced. With that diplomatic win in hand, OPEC officially lifted the embargo in March of 1974, 5 months after it began, amid internal disagreement over how much longer to keep it running. Energy historian Daniel Yergin later wrote that the episode had, in his words, remade the international economy. Biographer Robert Lacey took a harder line, arguing the embargo achieved not one of its stated political objectives. Israel came out of the war better armed than before, and the ceasefire itself likely would have happened, embargo or not. But whatever it failed to achieve politically, it succeeded economically and permanently. Prices did not come back down. Not that year, not the next, not for the rest of the decade. Some of that 1973 mechanics are showing up again in 2026, and some of it isn't, and the differences matter as much as the similarities. Start with what's the same. Both crises begin with a regional war that oil-producing governments did not start but immediately weaponized. Both saw traders move prices before physical barrels stopped flowing, fear pricing in scarcity ahead of any actual shortage. Both forced a coordinated government response using tools built specifically because of crises like this. In 2026, the 32 member states of the International Energy Agency unanimously released 400 million barrels from strategic reserves in March, roughly 20 days' worth of normal Hormuz throughput. The IEA itself, worth noting, was founded in 1974 specifically because the world had no coordinated reserve release mechanism during the embargo that started this whole comparison. And in both cases, the country wielding oil as a weapon ended up somewhat trapped by its own leverage. Analysts at Oxford's Blavatnik School have described Iran's position in 2026 as Tehran depends on the same waterway it's trying to close. In a way, Saudi Arabia in 1973, sitting on its own oil and controlling its own export terminals, simply did not. Now, the differences, and they're structural, not cosmetic. 1973 was a pricing and export embargo, a deliberate decision by producing governments to withhold their own oil as leverage. 2026 is a physical blockade during an active shooting war, means missile strikes on tankers, a strait closed by force rather than by policy. Iran doesn't set OPEC's price the way the 1973 Arab producers did. It controls a choke point, which is a different kind of power with a different kind of vulnerability. There's a second difference that matters just as much. In 1973, the embargoing nations owned the oil they were withholding. In 2026, Iran is blocking the transit of oil that mostly belongs to other Gulf states, Iraq, Kuwait, Qatar, the UAE, not primarily its own. That's a big part of why Iran's own oil exports reportedly kept rising during parts of this crisis, even while the strait was nominally closed. According to New York Times reporting on trade data, it's a fundamentally different economic logic than choosing to sit on your own barrels. So what does the 1973 outcome actually suggest is coming? If the pattern held exactly, you'd expect prices to spike hard, then settle at a new floor well above where they started, permanently. But the U.S. Energy Information Administration's own July 2026 forecast doesn't show that. It shows Brent averaging around $70 a barrel in the fourth quarter of this year, and $65 in 2027, a reversion toward pre-crisis pricing, not a new permanent floor. That's the opposite of what happened after 1973, at least according to the data available as this is being recorded. There's a real chance this parallel simply doesn't finish the way 1973 did, and the honest version of this video has to say so. The clearest breakdown is in the resolution mechanism itself. 1973 ended through months of patient bilateral disengagement, diplomacy between Kissinger and Arab leadership, tied to actual Israeli troop withdrawals from occupied territory, a slow process, but a stable one once it landed. 2026 already has something 1973 never had, a signed transactional agreement, the Islamabad Memorandum, worked out at the Palace of Versailles in June with specific reciprocal terms, mine-clearing deadlines, a phased end to the U.S. naval blockade, sanctions relief, a nuclear negotiation window. That's a more modern, more instrumentalized kind of deal. And it's already shown cracks that 1973's slower diplomatic unwind never really did. The July 6th attacks on tankers came less than 3 weeks after that agreement was signed. One trade publication reported that Iran's military command declared a full blockade reinstated on June 20th, though that specific claim hasn't been confirmed by major wire services, so treat it as contested rather than settled. Prices themselves are behaving differently, too. Where 1973's price level never came back down, 2026's has already round-tripped more than once, spiking and easing within the same week. If the deal held in 1973 because both sides had something durable to point to, it's genuinely an open question whether Islamabad has that same durability or whether it's already coming apart. As of this recording, on July 10th, 2026, the ceasefire's status depends on which day you ask and which official you ask it of. President Trump has called it over in one breath. and said he doesn't expect a return to full war in the next. The Treasury has pulled back its authorization for Iranian oil sales. Ship tracking data shows reduced but continuing transits through Hormuz, mostly along routes Iran has explicitly permitted. Brent sits somewhere in the mid-70s per barrel, well off its March peak, but still above where it traded before any of this began. 20,000 mariners and roughly 2,000 ships sat stranded in the Gulf at one point this spring, some for over 100 days. That's not a statistic that resolves itself quietly. Gulf oil production shut-ins fell from 11.2 million barrels a day in May to 8.3 million in June, according to the EIA. Real recovery, but not a full one. What 1973 actually tells you is narrower than the popular version of that story suggests. It tells you that choke point shocks move markets on fear before physical supply changes, that coordinated reserve releases are a direct institutional legacy of that earlier crisis, and that political settlements, not oil markets on their own, are usually what ends these things. What it doesn't tell you is how this one ends, because the mechanism is different enough that the outcome might be too. The 1973 price level never came down. Whether 2026's dose is, as of today, still an open question, the data hasn't answered. Whatever comes next, it will show up first in a shipping lane and only later in a headline.